The duty supervisor prepares the Wellington Tramway Museum in Queen Elizabeth Park for the onrush of another crowd of Saturday visitors. The museum at Paikakariki, just north of Wellington, has been open weekends and public holidays since its beginning in 1965. The museum's goal is to preserve Wellington's tramway heritage, and visitors can ride in one of the museum's restored tramcars and soak up the nostalgia of the period when these were running on the streets of the city. The story of the Wellington Tramway system started long ago on the other side of the world. Mass public transport enabled new factories and offices springing up in the early 1800s to get a ready supply of labour following the industrialisation of major cities. In New Zealand, urban public transport began in February 1862, when the first passenger tramway system in New Zealand commenced operation. The Dun Mountain Railway in Nelson was built to carry chromium ore for shipment to England, and one of the conditions of its operation was that the company ran a passenger service along the streets of Nelson. Wellington entered the story in August 1878, when the first tramcars to grace the streets of Wellington were small four-wheeled tramcars hauled by a tiny steam-powered engine. These were very modern for their time. However, not everyone was impressed by the new technology. The noise, soot, and disturbance to horses created a lot of opposition, and the steam engines were replaced by horses in 1882. The company operating the system ran into financial difficulties, and the Wellington City Council eventually took it over in 1900. The council decided to adopt electric trams, and in 1904 the first one ran from a new depot at Newtown to the Basin Reserve. At the same time, the gauge of the track was changed and the total length of the route was increased to 10 miles. Power was supplied by a coal-fired steam power station, and steel poles were erected down the centre of the streets to support the overhead wires. The first electric tramcars were built in England and included several open-sided, cross-seating trams. These trams soon proved to be hazardous, especially to the conductors, who occasionally fell off or were struck by other vehicles. A 1913 Act of Parliament banned trams with no centre aisle, and many trams were converted to double saloon cars with open seating in the centre. There were ultimately 274 trams built for use in Wellington. 14 were horse-drawn, 260 were passenger electric trams, and 2 were freight only. This early film clip, taken in the late 1920s, shows how trams were so much a part of the everyday life of the streets of Wellington. Much later, in the early 1960s, when trams were beginning to be replaced by buses, the streets of Wellington were still dominated by the later Fiducia-type tramcars, with all the double saloons having been withdrawn. Tunnels were driven through Wellington's hills at Seatoun, Hataitai, Karori and Northland, and tram servicing and storage sheds were built at Newtown, Thorndon and Kilbirnie. Each tram service displayed a destination sign and route number, and as well as the driver, or motorman as they were called, a conductor sold and clipped tickets. The routes of most trams originated and ended at the Wellington railway station. Noel Donaldson, who started as a conductor and eventually became a motorman, well remembers his daily routine.
As a conductor, when you turned up in the morning, you signed on and got your timesheet, and then you went to the office, and which had a little cubby hole where you reported to the inspector, and he handed over you a box which contained all your tickets for the day. You never got any cash because all conductors carried a float, which was 10 shillings, and you had to carry that with you all the time while you were conducting, and that had to be handed back once you finished conducting. But it was used, conductors used to use it for other things other than the trams if they were a bit short of money, which, well, they did do, but they shouldn't have done. And then you just found out the person that you signed on with, you found out what your tram was, what row it was on, and you just went down to get the tram all ready, and the motorman should have been there checking it all out to see all the mechanical side of the tram was working all right. When I say mechanics, make sure that the air brake was working, the handbrake was working, and check the sandboxes to see that the sand was all right.
Wellington is predominantly a hilly city, and trams were called on to transport its residents to their hilltop suburbs. One route took trams up Brooklyn Road, and the comings and goings of trams on this steep hill were captured on film one day in the mid-1950s. Life as a driver could have its moments, and having to navigate the narrow streets with cars trying to get past or turning in front were hazards of the job. Noel Donaldson recalls one occasion that has stuck in his mind.
One day when I was driving down Manor Street, heading towards Willow Street, Manor Street, what they call Parrott's Corner, I was heading to the railway station, and a lady in a 1939 Citroen motor car, and I knew it was a 39 because that's the model that came out with a big boot on the back. She pulled out in front of me with no indicators whatsoever, just straight out in front of me. The 1939 had the little indicator that came out from the window frame, and she never had that on or anything, and just pulled straight out in front of me, and I ran into her, shot the car up on the footpath, and she couldn't get out of that side of the car. She had to go across and get out of the other side of the car, And I said to a lady, I said, you didn't give any indicators. No, beg your pardon, she says to me, didn't you see my indicator? And I said, lady, you never gave any indicator. And she said, oh, but I put my arm out the window. And I said, lady, wound your window up pretty quick, because the window was still wound up tight. And then she says to me, she said, but you didn't even attempt to swerve out of my way. And of course, I'm driving a tram.
Nothing lasts forever, and early in 1960, the Wellington City Council passed a formal resolution authorising the raising of a loan to enable the complete changeover from trams to buses. On the 2nd of May in 1964, large crowds gathered along the only remaining route to witness the last trams to run through the streets of Wellington, and also the last trams in regular passenger service in any city in New Zealand. Three trams were driven down to Thorndon for a closing ceremony there. Then, following speeches from invited dignitaries, they moved off for the final time, bound for the Newtown sheds, where another ceremony was held, with a symbolic closing of the large shed doors for the last time. This, however, would not be the final time that Wellington Trams would run passenger services. At a meeting held in March 1965, the president of a new group, adopting the name the Wellington Tramway Museum, reported that negotiations had been completed for the acquisition of several trams, track and associated equipment, and that a site had been secured for the development of a working museum. The following year saw the opening of the Tramway Museum at Queen Elizabeth Park, just north of Paikakariki. The many hours volunteers have spent laying track is evident in this film footage taken one Sunday morning in 1971. Henry Britton is the current president of the Wellington Tramway Museum and outlines some of the museum's activities.
I joined the Tramway Museum in 1965. At that stage, the Tram Museum had been going for about 12 months. But I was always interested in trams because my grandfather was a tramway inspector. And when I grew up, I was aware of his job, used to ride on the trams with him at various times, and that installed a lifetime interest in Wellington tramcars. The Tramway Museum is open on a Saturday and a Sunday, plus public holidays, and also on Wednesdays, but Wednesday is not an operating day. We operate from 11 o'clock in the morning until 4:30 at night on those open days, and on Wednesday there's no power on, but that's our work day. Now we have two groups of people here at the weekends. One is the crew who run the service, run the trams, open the shop, sell the fares, drive the trams, sell souvenirs, drinks out of the shop, and others who may be here are working on the trams and doing some of the maintenance, some of the restoration, and some of the ongoing things that actually need to be done. Wednesday is more of our major day because the power is not on, trams aren't working. We do overhead and other things that are essential things to be done, which can't be done on an operating day.
The museum is continually restoring and maintaining its fleet of tramcars, and Trevor Burling, who has been doing this work for many years, describes what is involved.
My interest in trams began back in 1970 when I became a member of the Tramway Historical Society at Ferrymead in Christchurch. When I was there, I started on the gangs that were restoring trams at Ferrymead and became interested in particular in the bodywork and the woodwork that goes into trams, and trams are substantially made of wood. So I found that was very rewarding, and skills that I learned when I was at school, just being able to measure and cut accurately and replicate what the craftsmen years ago had made our trams to look like. We had to just do the same high quality work to ensure that the tram looked right and that everything was safe and went together properly. Eventually I moved to Wellington, where I became interested in the Wellington Tramway Museum, and my first task here was working on one of the older double saloon trams, and in that case it was a matter of rebuilding the roof, which was in very poor condition at that point. It leaked, and every time it was taken out, poor old 151 really got a soaking both inside and out. So we replaced all of the roof on that, and using woodwork skills again. After that was all completed, we moved on to Tram 260, and since then I've been working on not just woodwork but the wiring as well. Many years ago I used to be an electrician and gained some skills from there, but even engineering skills are things that you pick up as you go along. Well, this is Tram 260, which is our current restoration project. As you can see, it's the bones of the tram at the moment. In other words, it's the framework. All of the cladding is off it around the front end anyway, and it's covered in primer paint and various other bits and pieces that are going on whilst it's being restored. And essentially we start from there. One of the important aspects of a tram is the fact that it runs on electricity, and so that we can control that electricity to the motors, we have a controller, which there's one at both ends of the tram, and the driver uses the controller to graduate through the power notches so that electricity is supplied to the motors gradually. Otherwise it'll be like turning on a switch and we're off down the track at 90 kilometres an hour. And the device that's open and we're looking at the moment is one of those controllers, and that has to be all adjusted properly and make sure that everything works correctly, so that we have faith in the thing and it's going to do what we expect. Well, I'm standing inside the driving compartment, or one of the driving compartments of 260, and right in front of me are the controls that the driver would use. Now, just like in a car, we have an accelerator, which is the controller, and then we have the brake. These are used in unison so that the tram moves off smoothly and gathers speed smoothly without throwing the passengers about. And then when we want to stop, then we use the brake, and that is also applied smoothly, and it actually operates on air. When the passengers want to get in and out, we have a door controller, which is just in front of the driver again. So everything that he needs to be able to deal with is right there, and can control those whilst watching the road ahead and drive the tram safely. Well, the restoration of 260 has been going on for about 20 years now. We lack resource in terms of people to help us with this project, and of course funds, but in the fullness of time we'd like to complete it, and our short-term goal is to at least get it up and running and out the door by next year. And if we are fortunate enough to get enough hands on deck, as they say, to push that on, then by next year we should achieve that at least.
The museum has an assortment of other tasks that also need attending to, and members help out during weekends or on Wednesday workdays.
Anybody who wanted to come along to the Tram Museum and participate, we have a lot of people around the museum who are willing to teach those skills to anybody. We don't expect people to be born with them. We learn all of those kind of things as we go along. And that's how we got to where we are today, with a collection of people with various skills, and we can call on them and teach other people to assist us. There's about 80 odd members, and I suppose a core of about 25 who actually get involved in the museum. But having said that, a lot of those members don't necessarily live in this location. Some of them are distant members. The running crew is rostered through every week and so forth. And then the crew that we have that do the restoration, I suppose there's about 9 or 10 of us who turn our hand to various things around the site, including tram restoration.
We'll now take a tram journey down to the beach and back again to experience what riding in a Wellington tram car is like.
Do your ticket. Yeah. You local people or?
The tram we are riding in is Fiducia Type 239. This is one of 4 of this type owned by the museum and one of a batch of 29 built at the Kilbirnie workshops of the Wellington City Corporation between 1933 and 1952. We are now viewing an older double saloon type 159. This tram was built in 1925 and was one of the last of its type built before they were altered to have a more stylish appearance. They were the most numerous of Wellington's tram cars, and a total of 140 were built between 1913 and 1935. The Tramway Museum is open on weekends and public holidays, when throughout the day it runs regular return services from the park entrance to the beach. As the shadows lengthen, it's time to close up the museum until another day, when the Wellington trams will be back in business. The story of the Wellington Tramway system started long ago. Wellington entered the story in August 1878, when the first tram cars to grace the streets of Wellington were small four-wheeled tram cars hauled by a tiny steam-powered engine. The first electric tram cars were built in England and included several open-sided cross-seating trams. These trams soon proved to be hazardous, especially to the conductors, who occasionally fell off or were struck by other vehicles. This early film clip, taken in the late 1920s, shows how trams were so much a part of the everyday life of the streets of Wellington. Nothing lasts forever. On the 2nd of May in 1964, large crowds gathered along the only remaining route to witness the last trams to run through the streets of Wellington. 3 trams were driven down to Thorndon for a closing ceremony there. Then, following speeches from invited dignitaries, they moved off for the final time, bound for the Newtown sheds. At a meeting held in March 1965, the president of a new group, adopting the name the Wellington Tramway Museum, reported that negotiations had been completed for the acquisition of several trams, track and associated equipment, and that a site had been secured for the development of a working museum. We'll now take a tram journey down to the beach and back again. Time to close up the museum until another day, when the Wellington trams will be back in business.